Picture booting up your Game Boy and seeing a game that was never supposed to exist, a Pokémon title that was planned, developed, maybe even partially completed, but never made it to store shelves. I'm talking about the lost Pokémon games, the ones that existed only in trademark filings, developer interviews, and the fevered imaginations of fans who were convinced they could predict what Game Freak was planning next. Some of these games were real projects that got cancelled during development. Others were just rumors that took on lives of their own, spreading through gaming forums and becoming so widely believed that fans started expecting them to actually happen. And a few were probably never real at all, just speculation that got out of hand and turned into gaming urban legends. What I find fascinating about these lost games is how they reveal the gap between what fans expect from the Pokémon franchise and what Game Freak actually decides to create. Every time a new generation launches, the rumor mill immediately starts churning with predictions about what the third version or definitive edition will be, and sometimes those predictions become so widespread that they feel more real than the actual games that eventually get released. So let's dive into the Pokémon games that never were, the development stories that got buried, and the rumors that became so convincing that some fans are probably still waiting for these games to be announced. Let me start with probably the most mysterious entry in Pokémon's lost game library, Pokémon Pink. Now this one is interesting because there's actually concrete evidence that Game Freak was at least thinking about it. Back in the late 1990s, Nintendo filed trademarks for Pokémon Pink, alongside the more familiar red, blue and yellow trademarks. The trademark filing is where the facts end, and the speculation begins, because Game Freak never officially announced what Pokémon Pink was supposed to be. But the timing of the trademark suggests it was being considered as either an alternative to Yellow, or possibly as a fourth version in the original generation. The most popular theory among fans is that Pokémon Pink would have been a Clefairy or Jigglypuff-focused version, similar to how Yellow was built around Pikachu. This makes sense from a marketing perspective because both of those Pokémon were heavily featured in early Pokémon promotional materials and were clearly being positioned as potential mascot characters alongside Pikachu. What's really interesting about this theory is that it reveals how different the Pokémon franchise could have been if Game Freak had made different early decisions about which Pokémon to center their marketing around. Clefairy was actually supposed to be the original mascot before Pikachu took over, so Pokémon Pink might have been a way to revisit that earlier concept. But here's where it gets more speculative. Some fans believe that Pokémon Pink was intended to have a different tone or aesthetic than the other games in the series. The idea was that it would appeal more directly to female players with a pinker color scheme, more emphasis on cute Pokémon, and possibly different storylines that focused more on friendship and cooperation than on battling and competition. Whether or not that was actually Game Freak's intention, the concept of Pokémon Pink became this symbol of roads not taken in the franchise's development. It represented the possibility of a Pokémon game that would have been explicitly designed for a different demographic, with different values and priorities than the main series. The trademark for Pokémon Pink eventually expired without being used, which officially closed the book on whatever that game was supposed to be. But the speculation around it continued for years, and you'll still occasionally see fan projects or ROM hacks that try to imagine what Pokémon Pink might have looked like if it had actually been developed. Moving on to a more recent disappointment, let's talk about Pokémon Gray, the third version that everyone was absolutely convinced was coming after Black and White, and that Game Freak decided to just not make. This one stings because it seemed so obvious that it was going to happen. The pattern had been established for over a decade. You release two paired versions, then follow up with a definitive third version that combines and improves on both. Yellow after red and blue, crystal after gold and silver, emerald after ruby and sapphire, platinum after diamond and pearl. It was practically a law of Pokémon game development. Black and White seemed perfectly set up for this treatment. The games had clear version differences, legendary Pokémon that could easily be combined in a third version, and a storyline that felt like it could be expanded and improved with additional content. Everything was pointing toward Pokémon Gray as the obvious next step. I remember the speculation around this being incredibly confident. It wasn't a question of whether Pokémon Gray would happen, It was a question of when it would be announced and what new features it would include. Fan communities were already theorizing about how Kyurem would be incorporated, what the expanded storyline would look like, and how the game would improve on the original Black and White formula. And then Game Freak just did. Instead, they jumped straight to Black 2 and White 2, which were direct sequels rather than a definitive third version. This was completely unprecedented in the series, and caught everyone off guard. What makes this particularly interesting is that Black 2 and White 2 were actually excellent games that did a lot of what fans expected from Pokémon Gray, just in a different format. They expanded the storyline, added new areas, included more Pokémon, and generally improved on the original games in exactly the ways that a third version would have. But the decision to make sequels instead of a third version represented a fundamental shift in how Game Freak was thinking about the Pokémon franchise. It suggested they were moving away from the predictable pattern that fans had come to expect, and toward a more experimental approach to follow-up games. The absence of Pokémon Gray became this symbol of Game Freak's willingness to subvert fan expectations, even when those expectations were based on well-established patterns. It was the first sign that the company was no longer interested in following the same formula indefinitely. But if you want to talk about a lost Pokémon game that really got fans worked up, let's discuss Pokémon Stars, the Nintendo Switch version of Sun and Moon that everyone was convinced was coming, and that turned into one of the most elaborate examples of collective wishful thinking in gaming history. The logic behind Pokémon Stars seemed absolutely bulletproof at the time. Sun and Moon had been hugely successful on the 3DS. The Nintendo Switch was launching and needed major software support, and Game Freak had never released a mainline Pokémon game on a home console before. A definitive version of Sun and Moon on the Switch seemed like the most obvious business decision imaginable. The rumors around Pokémon Stars weren't just fan speculation. They were being reported by gaming news outlets with sources inside the industry. Multiple publications claimed to have insider information about the game's development, its planned features, and its expected release window. This wasn't just wishful thinking, it felt like legitimate reporting about a real project. The speculation got incredibly detailed. Fans were discussing what the improved graphics would look like, how the game would take advantage of the Switch's capabilities, and what new content would be added to justify the new platform. Some rumors suggested it would include additional Z moves, expanded post-game content, and possibly even new Pokémon that hadn't appeared in the original games. What made the Pokémon Stars rumors particularly compelling was how much sense they made from both a business and creative perspective. The Switch was desperately in need of major exclusive software. Pokémon games had always been system sellers, and Sun and Moon had introduced enough new concepts that an expanded version could have showcased significant improvements. And then Game Freak announced Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon instead, enhanced versions of the original games, but still for the 3DS rather than the Switch. The collective disappointment from fans who had been expecting Pokémon Stars was palpable. What's interesting about this situation is how it revealed the gap between what seemed like logical business decisions and what Game Freak was actually planning. From the outside, Pokémon Stars looked like such an obvious move that its absence felt almost incomprehensible. But Game Freak was apparently working on a different timeline and had different priorities than what fans and industry observers were expecting. They weren't ready to make the jump to Switch development yet, and they saw more value in creating enhanced 3DS versions than in porting the games to new hardware. The Pokémon Stars situation became a lesson in the dangers of treating industry rumors as confirmed facts, even when those rumors come from seemingly reliable sources and make perfect logical sense. It reminded everyone that game development is more complex and unpredictable than it appears from the outside. Beyond these major disappointments, there's a whole category of Pokémon games that have existed primarily in the realm of persistent rumors and fan speculation. The Pokémon MMO is probably the most enduring of these mythical projects. For over 2 decades, fans have been convinced that Game Freak is secretly working on a massively multiplayer online Pokémon game that will finally let players interact in a truly shared world. This rumor resurfaces constantly, often tied to new hardware launches or major Pokémon announcements. Every time Nintendo releases new online capabilities or Game Freak experiments with online features, fans immediately start speculating that this is the foundation for the inevitable Pokemon MMO. The persistence of this rumor reveals something important about what fans actually want from the Pokemon franchise. Despite the series' success as a primarily single-player experience, there's clearly a significant portion of the fanbase that craves more social and multiplayer elements. But there's also a practical reality that these fans often ignore. Developing and maintaining an MMO is incredibly expensive and risky, and it would require Game Freak to fundamentally change how they approach Pokemon game development. The rumor persists because fans want it to be true, not because there's any real evidence that it's being developed. Then there are the spin-off games that were rumored but never materialized, supposed sequels to popular side games like Pokemon Snap or Pokemon Colosseum that fans were convinced were in development based on survey data, patent filings, or offhand comments from developers in interviews. These rumors often had just enough basis in reality to seem plausible. Maybe Nintendo had conducted market research about interest in certain types of games, or maybe a developer had mentioned in an interview that they'd like to revisit a particular concept someday. But somewhere in the transmission from industry reality to fan speculation, these possibilities became expectations and then transformed into rumors about games that were supposedly already in development. What's fascinating about all of these lost games, the real ones, the rumored ones, and the completely imaginary ones, is how they shaped fan expectations and influenced the actual direction of the Pokemon franchise. Even when these games never existed, the speculation around them created pressure on Game Freak to address fan desires and respond to community expectations. The absence of Pokemon Gray led to more experimental follow-up games. The disappointment around Pokemon Stars eventually contributed to Game Freak's decision to finally bring the mainline series to console with Sword and Shield. The persistent demand for a Pokemon MMO influenced the social features that were included in later games. In some ways, these lost games were more influential than many actual releases because they represented pure potential. They were whatever fans most wanted them to be, without the limitations and compromises that real game development inevitably requires. Some of these lost games were probably real ideas that got cancelled during development, victims of changing priorities, technical limitations, or business decisions that fans will never fully understand. Others were just fan dreams that took on lives of their own, spreading through gaming communities until they felt more real than the actual games being developed. But regardless of whether they were real or imaginary, these lost games became part of the Pokemon franchise's mythology. They represent the roads not taken, the possibilities that might have been, and the ongoing tension between what fans expect from the series and what Game Freak actually chooses to create. Do you think any of these lost games would have been better than what we actually got? Are there any rumored Pokemon projects that you're still hoping might somehow become real? Or do you think the speculation around these non-existent games reveals more about fan psychology than it does about actual game development? Well, stick around for the best Pokemon channel that exists, I guess. I mean, probably anyways.